Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Baz, Head of Brand here at Whitworth. I'm acting as facilitator for this fascinating webinar on immense nutrient power of nut seeds and dried fruit. We're really thrilled to bring together a community of forward-thinking minds passionate about reshaping the future of health and nutrition in the UK. As you may know, we face a significant challenge. Diet-related diseases have reached critical levels, with food now contributing to more global deaths than smoking. This issue isn't just about overconsumption of processed foods, it's also about what we're missing in our diets. Research has shown that 8 of the top 10 diet-related causes of death are linked to a lack of essential nutrients, particularly those found in fruits, nuts, seeds, fibre and unsaturated fats. Our session today will shine a light on the potential of these often overlooked nutrients to reduce chronic disease risk, improve overall health, and even ease the burden on our healthcare system. We'll also look at compelling, robust research showing how daily portions of nuts, seeds, and dried fruits can support heart health, lower type 2 diabetes, and promote mental well-being. Essentially, it will show how daily portions of nuts, seeds, and dried fruit can essentially save lives. As a continuation of our launch event at the Gherkin back in April, and to explore these insights in greater depth, we are honoured to have Dr. Max Gowland with us to essentially distill his 90-page, 200-reference white paper endorsed by the British Nutrition Foundation on the benefit of consuming more dried fruit, nuts and seeds into an engaging 50-minute presentation. Just before I hand over to Dr. Max, please be aware that my role as facilitator is to capture your questions from the Q&A. So feel free to type these into the box as we go along. And I'll put a selection of these to Max at the end of our webinar. We'll come back next week to respond to any questions that we can't cover today because of time. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Dr. Max.
Thanks very much indeed, Baz. So, as Baz said, I spent many months writing this white paper, 200 references. It took me about 6 months to look at all the science behind nuts, seeds and dried fruits, but it was absolutely fascinating. But originally, I was actually given a brief by Whitworths, and the brief was very simple. What impact does nuts, seeds and dried fruits actually have on the health of the nation? Very wide brief, but that gave me a lot of rope to really have a look at this in quite some detail. So the agenda for today, very briefly, it's in 3 parts. The first part, I'm afraid you're going to be a little bit depressed because I'm going to talk about all the diseases and I'm going to look at how sick we are as a nation. Section 2, equally depressing, where I'm going to mention briefly our diet. How well are we doing versus the government targets? But the most interesting part, and this sort of will make us feel a little bit better, hopefully at the end, where I briefly skate over the science behind nuts, seeds and dried fruits and the health benefits. So let's start off with section 1. How sick are we as a nation? Well, let's start with lifespan and health span. This is a life expectancy graph, males and females from 80 to 2022. You can see that every couple of years there's more and more life expectancy. But the last couple of years there's been a slowing down and in fact a slight dip. There's massive debate about what that dip might be linked to. But as you can see, it isn't good news. You know, we are not continuing to get longer and longer lives. But more important, I think, is health span. If you take the top arrow, typical normal aging will be, first of all, many years spent healthy, a health span, and then you enter the dreaded red zone, which is where you are unhealthy and perhaps even disabled to some extent. If you look at optimal longevity, you actually compress the morbidity at the end. And what we're trying to do here with health is to extend health span, not necessarily lifespan, although it would be nice to have an extra few years. The trouble is healthy years are actually falling. This is some ONS data, Office for National Statistics data, showing disability-free life expectancy. And let me quickly interpret one of the lines for you. Take the orange line, which is the female line. What it's saying is in 2006, 7, 8, and 9, typically an average a woman would live 65 years totally free of disease on average. Today, unfortunately, an average woman is only living just over 60 in healthy years. So basically what it's saying is in 15 years, women have literally lost nearly 4 years of healthy life. That is not a good sign. I have some data here on the left. I'll not go through it. But if you look at the snapshot of health in the UK, this was a survey again done by ONS 3 years ago. What it's saying is 53% of the over 16s population is currently on medication. It's an unbelievable stat. 33% have allergies, nearly 20% high blood pressure, a lot of people with back pain, 15% with depression, 12% high blood lipids, cholesterol, LDL, etc., and 9% have type 2 diabetes. Again, not a great picture. So chronic disease in the UK, I mean, it's multifactorial, but some of the top diseases, and if I can include obesity as one of those, is huge. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension or high blood pressure, NAFLD, which probably is a new term to some of you, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, various cancer subtypes, mental health, and also sarcopenia. Again, a lot of people don't know what that is. It's basically age-related loss of muscle, which can give rise to a variety of musculoskeletal issues. But the one which really sticks in my mind is the fact that over half of us are on prescription medication. One of the main silver bullet of health, of course, is exercise. We hear this talked about on a daily basis, basically. And this was a YouGov poll done a few years ago. And basically, without getting into the detail, the bottom line is that 35% of the population admit doing absolutely zero exercise. We know that poor diet is critical, a critical cause of chronic diseases. And we're going to look at diet later on. But there's a whole range of factors. We talked about no exercise, smoking. I still find it extraordinary that people are smoking today. Alcohol, obesity, of course, linked to many chronic diseases. Age is a massive risk factor. Excess sugar. Sugar is the white devil now. Poor sleep and high blood lipids or high blood fats. So let's quickly look at obesity. We know that we're in an obesity crisis, but when you look at the data, it's really quite frightening. Here's a graph indicating the BMI of the population in the 1950s. And if you can see it on the slide, the vertical solid line is the overweight line. And as you can see, maybe about 3, 4, 5% of people in the 50s were overweight and nobody was obese. 30 years later, 1980s, it's about 50-50. And there's maybe 2, 3, 4% of people starting to get into the obesity. If I look at today's statistics, wow, look at that. Probably 60%, 70% are not only overweight, are not only obese, but also severely obese. And this red part of the curve is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. These are some stats from NHS Digital, looking at obese, overweight people at various age groups. And basically what that's telling us, without looking at the detail, you can look at that later because you'll have the presentation, nearly 3/4 of people aged between 45 and 74 are either overweight or obese. So let's talk cardiovascular health. Cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer in the Western world. The heart is under enormous pressure. It beats 100,000 times every day. It takes 5 liters of blood around the circulatory system. And believe it or not, there are 60,000 miles of blood vessels, capillaries, which the heart has to pump the blood around. It's really quite extraordinary. The problem is that 7 to 8 million people in the UK are currently living with a whole range of cardiovascular diseases. If you look at the British Heart Foundation website, they're saying 2.3 million are living with CHD, coronary heart disease, specific to the heart. It's costing the NHS over £9 billion per annum. Just to put it in perspective, CVD, and I'll talk about CVD later, cardiovascular disease, it kills double the number of people that kill women from breast cancer, just to put it in perspective. And we know that 100,000 people are killed by heart disease and stroke every single year. The biggest problem is ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Hopefully you can see this little video showing the buildup of fatty plaques in an artery, which is called ischemia, which is causing reduced blood flow and sometimes causes a blood clot and maybe even a blockage. That is very serious, obviously. ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The main risk factors for cardiovascular disease, going from left to right: high blood fat, cholesterol, the lipid panel test, which is what the doctor does now and again; high blood pressure, too much sugar in the blood, diabetes; too much weight, smoking again, and of course being sedentary. And to just give you some stats on top of each of these, 8 million people are currently on statins trying to keep their cholesterol down. 28% of people have diagnosed blood pressure. That's a lot of people. Over 4 million people have type 2 diabetes. 26% of people are obese. 6 to 7 million smoke still, and over 33% do no exercise at all, according to that poll. Diabetes, 5.1 million have diabetes. Slightly higher than the 4 million I just talked to you about, because many diabetics are not actually, they haven't gone to the doctor and they don't really know they've got diabetes. It's caused by too much sugar in the blood. Sugar needs very, very tight regulation. Too much sugar in the blood is very toxic. And believe it or not, only about 4 grams, 1 teaspoonful of sugar is in the blood. A few milligrams higher or lower means you have real problems. There are 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon, from the pancreas, which basically control blood sugar. And we know glucose is needed by all our cells for energy, but insulin is needed to help the glucose actually enter the cells. Type 2, it's a typical Western disease. Too little exercise, too many calories, too much fat in the diet, too much sugar in the diet. These are the big risk factors. Pre-diabetes can be reversed. These are the people that are just entering diabetes. And if you lose weight, exercise, and a decent diet, you can actually rid yourself of any potential risk to enter diabetes. And it basically happens 2 ways. Type 1 diabetics literally cannot make insulin. Type 2 diabetics can make insulin, but the cells are insulin resistant. The insulin doesn't actually force the glucose into the cells. So we have 14 million people at very high risk of developing diabetes, which means there's a failure to clear blood sugar, and 20% of pre-diabetics enter type 2 within the next 5 years. And it costs the NHS a fortune, around 14 billion per annum. And obesity and diabetes have unfortunately tracked very closely together since the 70s. So they are very much associated with each other. If you talk to the CEO of diabetes, Chris Askew, he will say that the latest figures show that we're in a grip of a massive diabetes crisis, which is escalating. Spiraling numbers of people are now living with type 2, and millions are at high risk of developing the condition as we go forward. And the downstream effects of diabetes are many, many complications, not only things like heart attacks and strokes, but glaucoma, cataracts, nephropathy, problems with the kidneys, neuropathy, problems with the nerves, diabetic foot, etc., etc. Moving swiftly on to the liver, very, very important. Let's do a quick liver 101. Very important organ. It is responsible for making cholesterol and also removing cholesterol. So cholesterol is a good thing. You need cholesterol for life. Without cholesterol, we are not living. But you don't want too much of it, and you certainly don't want the so-called bad or LDL cholesterol. So the liver plays a really big role. It also takes glucose, sugar, in our blood and stores it in our muscles and the liver as glycogen. It deactivates toxins. It produces bile, which helps digest fat in our diet. It also looks after amino acids. It can synthesize new amino acids. Hormones and receptors, hormones and enzymes are produced, and also it helps the absorption of vitamins. If you take NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is where people have a lot of fat actually within the liver cells themselves. Unfortunately, nearly 30% of the population are walking around right now in the UK with NAFLD. You can see the liver on the left is healthy. The liver in the middle is quite fatty. The liver on the right is irreversibly healthy. You cannot go back to a healthy liver. This is called steatohepatitis and ultimately cirrhosis. And risk factors are typically what you'd expect. Bad diets, obesity. In fact, 66% of obese people suffer from NAFLD, 66%. Type 2 diabetes, high blood cholesterol, and also those people who are sedentary. Another problem is lack or loss of musculoskeletal health as we age, which is basically a triple whammy. If you look at bones, a healthy bone on the left, very strong, an osteoporotic bone on the right. This is typical osteoporosis. And osteoporosis happens to all of us, but it happens to some people a lot more. If you take menopausal women, typically average age 51, they lose around 1/3 of their bone strength at the menopause. If you look at the MRI scans on the right-hand side, look at a 25-year-old leg. It's a cross-section of the upper leg. See the bone in the middle and muscle around it. Look at the 63-year-old, a healthy 63-year-old, not a sick 63-year-old. And this is called sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss. You can see there's a massive difference there. And the third part is basically loss of joint space between loss of cartilage, which obviously is loss of joint space. That's a typical knee joint there. And musculoskeletal issues are as follows. Sarcopenia, muscle loss, 25% has gone by 65 years. That's a lot of muscle gone. Loss of bone strength, I just discussed. Maximum bone strength is at around 30 years old, but then there's a huge reduction at the menopause. Joint pain and immobility, osteoarthritis, about 10 million people are living with that. Falls and fractures increase dramatically with age. And if you have a hip fracture when you're a little bit older, and this is a stat which really jolts people, 27 to 33% will be dead within 12 months. And that is from a range of scientific publications. And that gives rise to around 30 million working days lost every year. So musculoskeletal health, very important. Briefly on cancer, about 1 in 2 of us will get cancer in our lifetime, especially as we get a little bit older. The risk massively increases, of course. But Cancer Research UK say that 38% of cancer cases in the UK are actually preventable. Smoking is a massive risk factor, as is obesity. Low fiber is a massive risk factor. We'll talk about fiber later. Too much alcohol, too much sunlight and sunbathing, processed meat, of course, and lack of exercise. If you address some or all of these, you can massively reduce the risk of cancer. And then on to mental health. 109 million days are lost every single year. It costs nearly £9 billion per annum. Just some stats from the papers that I've read. 19% of people have been diagnosed with depression at some point. That's a large percentage. Nearly 80% of adults feel stressed at least 1 day per month. 32% report they've got suicidal thoughts. That's not a very nice stat. And over 20 million antidepressants have been prescribed in 2021. So that just puts mental health in perspective. And before we finish our chronic disease part 1, I wanted to put this up. This is a fascinating study between Liverpool University and the Real Centre, where they try to forecast chronic disease from today right through for the next 20 years. And they are predicting huge increases in chronic disease over the next 20 years. Heart failure, plus 92%. Diabetes, plus 49%. Dementia, plus 45%. And it goes on and on. So again, this is going to cost the country billions and billions of pounds. And there will be lots of, unfortunately, very sick people around. I was very honoured to share the platform when I spoke at the Gherkin. Baz referred to the Gherkin presentation a few months ago in London. And Henry Dimbleby was asked by the government to lay out a national food strategy, which he did. And there's just 3 things I'd like to take from that food strategy. He said that poor diets cause 17% of all deaths. 17% of all deaths are due to poor diet. Total cost related to having a high BMI is 74 billion per annum, according to OECD. And he concluded that from a consumption viewpoint, we needed to eat more fruit and veg by 30%, fiber by 50%, because we're eating far too little fiber. High fat, sugar, salt foods need to reduce by at least a quarter, and meat consumption reduced by 30%. We know that poor diet is a critical cause of chronic disease. So just a thought, does the general public really appreciate how significantly diet is contributing to ill health? I think not, but it's an interesting question. Section 2 then, let's quickly go on to section 2, our diet. How well are we doing versus what we should be eating? And this is also a little bit of a sorry tale. I always start this presentation part with this beautiful quote from Dr. Sylvia Bolley, MD, in the US. She was giving a lecture, and she started it with this, and it was recently an article in Medscape, which I have a look at every single day. And she said, even if I give you pharmaceuticals or medicines, all I'm doing is just sprinkling a little bit of water on an oil fire because the fire is being fueled by a poor diet. And I think that puts the poor diet in perspective. So what should we be consuming? I think most of you know this, but this is a nice extract from the BNF, the British Nutrition Foundation. We should be getting at least our 5 a day. We know that. We should be eating more fiber. We should be eating plenty of high quality protein. Dairy is healthy, not too much, but dairy is perfectly healthy, and dairy alternatives. And if possible, we should choose the right fats. We'll talk about MUFAs and PUFAs. These are unsaturated fatty acids later. And we should certainly limit things like chocolates, biscuits, cakes, etc. But some will say that our poor diet is literally killing us. And multiple sources agree on this. If you look at the publication from Access to Nutrition, they say that poor diets are literally responsible for 17% of all deaths. The FSA, poor diets are responsible for 13%. There's a massive report called the Global Burden of Disease Study. They say poor diets cause 22% of deaths. Whether it's 13, 17, or 22, poor diets kill people. The CDC in the US, 70% of chronic disease could be prevented with diet. And Public Health England, PHE, a third of children are unfortunately overweight or obese. And the UK diet is a leading risk factor for many chronic diseases such as CVD, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancers. The NDNS, some of you will have heard of NDNS. It's the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. It's run by Public Health England, and they look at people's food diaries on an annual basis. And the NDNS data shows that UK population's diet does not meet recommendations. No surprise there. They said, in addition to obesity, the average UK diet is a leading risk factor in many diseases, such as heart disease, stroke, type 2, and many cancer subtypes. I think I put that stat up before in a different form. It's basically saying 78% of men over 60 are either overweight or obese. 78%, that's a huge amount. But if you look at the NDNS data, the detailed data which I've looked at, recently published, what it's saying is that according to not only food diaries, but also a technique called doubly labeled water, which is very accurate, men on average are consuming 246 extra kilocalories a day compared to what they should, and women are consuming an extra 125. So there is real evidence that on average we are consuming too many calories. Obesity and type 2 diabetes leads to 800,000 cases of cancer every single year, according to Diabetes UK research. So let's look at too much and let's look at too little. And this is a culmination of about 15 charts, which I've summarized onto one for quickness. How are we doing versus government guidelines? Well, look at calories first of all, or energy as I've called it. We are eating between 79 and 426 extra kilocalories every single day. Sugars, we should be consuming less than 5% of our total caloric intake. Unfortunately, we are consuming between 10 and 12%. Salt is very bad. We should be consuming less than 6 grams a day, far less if possible. We're consuming on average 8.4 grams a day, which means some people are going to be consuming 10, 11, 12 grams. Protein, we should be consuming around 50 grams a day. I personally would like to see more, especially with older people. Later science says that we do need more. But you can see we are eating enough protein according to the latest guidelines. Saturated fats are known to be a precursor to LDL cholesterol. That's the bad cholesterol, as some people call it. It's about right. We could be eating perhaps a little bit less than 12%. The target is less than 11. I'm not particularly worried about that. But let's focus a little bit now on too little. We're eating far too little oily fish. Oily fish is very important. It's a really good source of very helpful omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 is needed for brain health, heart health, and also vision. We should be eating around 140 grams a week. We're eating 56 grams on average. So we are eating far too little oily fish. Fruit and veg, the 5 a day. 71% are not eating our 5 a day. Take fiber. This is a big one. We should be eating at least 30 grams of fiber a day. The average intake is about 19 grams, which means many people will be eating even less than 10 grams a day. That's very unhealthy. And one that surprises a lot of people on vitamins and minerals, otherwise called micronutrients. Let's go on to the next graph because it puts it in perspective, but we're eating far too little vitamins and minerals on a daily basis. On 7 really important essential micronutrients, 70% of the UK are failing to reach the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. Look at the third one along, magnesium, 88% are not getting enough magnesium. Iron, 84% are not getting enough. Zinc, 75, vitamin D, 84. Biotin, one of the B vitamins, 85. Selenium, very powerful antioxidant, 74% are not reaching the RDA. And this is taken from detailed data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. This is really unhealthy. And it's important because these micronutrients will give us a whole range of health benefits like immunity, bone health, muscle health, brain health, energy, protection of cells against damage, blood health, heart function, digestion, etc. And if you're lacking on some of these micronutrients, unfortunately, some of these areas will be prone to problems. So what do we need to change diet-wise? Well, we need to eat less calories. That's clear. We need to eat less salt, less sugar, and certainly less saturated or unhealthy fats. Fruit and veg, we need more of that. Micronutrients, as I've just said, we definitely need more vitamins and essential minerals. Fiber, we definitely need more fiber, and we need more healthy fats in our diet. If you take the US Center for Disease Control, the CDC, they're saying 70% of chronic disease could be prevented by better diets. And the Global Burden of Disease study, I referred to that earlier, a diet low in nuts and seeds actually accounted for 341,000 deaths in the EU. I have no idea how they worked it out. It will be no doubt some highly complex algorithm, but that's what the GBD are saying. So a thought for this section, we need to focus on what we're not consuming enough of as much as what we are consuming too much of. And this is sometimes forgotten. So that's section 2 done, a little bit depressing. Section 3, let's move swiftly on to nuts, seeds and dried fruits and talk a little bit about the benefits and the science. What is a nut? What's actually in a nut which gives it the health benefits? So this is a very simple waterfall chart, just looking at the average nut. They all differ slightly, but the average nut contains, from left to right, a whole stack of protein, 20%, a little bit of saturated fat, 3, 4, 5% maximum. Then they contain a high level of MUFAs and PUFAs. That's monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And these are very helpful fats. Fiber, about 10% fiber, great to have. And we desperately need fiber. And the rest is polysaccharides, carbohydrates, and water. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a very small sliver under micronutrients. Now, it might look small, but don't forget micronutrients, you need literally micrograms and milligrams. So let's just see what the micrograms are. The micronutrients are. Well, the big and the most important helpful micronutrients in nuts are typically potassium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, selenium, vitamin E, biotin, folate, folic acid, and one of the B vitamins, thiamine. So these exist at pretty high levels in most nuts. And one thing I just wanted to clarify, we talk about fruit and veg all the time as being so healthy, and it is, but nuts and seeds contain much higher levels of really helpful nutrients than even veg. Take the two on the left, protein and fiber. Double the amount of fiber and 7 times the amount of protein compared to a typical veg. And I've averaged this over about 10 different vegetable and nut types just to make it simple. But if you look at the micronutrients, the minerals and the vitamins, you can see that nuts contain 3 times the amount of iron, 30 times the amount of copper, 8 times more iodine, 10 times more manganese, and it goes on and on. So I can't over-exaggerate enough. Nuts and seeds really are very, very healthy, down to the level of nutrients that they contain. And because they contain these, it allows nut manufacturers to actually make legally approved health claims under EFSA. EFSA is the food standards body in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority, which has approved around 240 health claims out of about 50,000 that were originally proposed a few years ago. And it's very, very difficult indeed to get a health claim under EFSA because the standard of the science is so high and so strict. But nuts have a whole variety of approved health claims, from muscle health, to fatigue, to cognition, to immunity, to lowering cholesterol, to keeping homocysteine under control, which is a nasty amino acid which builds up in our blood as we age, heart function, blood pressure. And if you look at walnuts, which are very healthy nuts, they even have a claim allowing walnuts to say that walnuts improves the elasticity of blood vessels. And elasticity is a very important thing to have. We do not want stiff blood vessels. But I wasn't just content with looking at EFSA. What I wanted to do was actually scan the literature and look at some of the other science that's been published. And there are literally tens of thousands of scientific papers. But what I tried to do was only concentrate on the top 4 types, the highest quality pieces of science. You can see on the right-hand side of the pyramid, an expert opinion is interesting, but it doesn't carry massive credibility. A case report is interesting and relevant, but it's only a case report. Basically, as you move up the pyramid, you become more and more credible, and the science becomes better and better. So I tended to concentrate on meta-analyses at the top, which is where scientists combine many tests, many trials together and apply statistics. Systematic reviews, and also RCTs, randomized controlled trials. So I only looked at the very best science. So let's start off with nuts. Well, basically, nuts significantly lower the mortality risk from heart disease. There were 4 trials done a few years ago. I can't quite read it, but the Iowa Women's Health, the Nurses' Health Study, the Physician Study, and the Adventist Health Study. These were 4 absolutely huge prospective studies across 18 years. And they proved that there was a 37% reduction in fatal coronary heart disease. 37%. That is pretty huge. They also worked out that for every weekly serving of only 28 grams of nuts, that gave an 8% less relative risk, an 8% reduction in potential CHD. The authors concluded in the paper that nuts may be among one of the most cardioprotective foods in a regular diet. So this is not me talking. This is the nutrients paper, the author, Ross. He actually decided to conclude this. In another review published only last year, they claimed that nuts lower the risk of cardiovascular disease up to 27%. And they looked at a whole range of diseases within CVD. They lowered cardiovascular events, things like heart attacks, by 19%, cardiovascular mortality by 25%, coronary heart disease by 24%, CHD mortality by 27%, stroke mortality by 18%, and atrial fibrillation, which is, you would then get a vibrating heart, not a pumping heart, by 15%. These are quite huge benefits to have from literally eating nuts. Perhaps the benefit might be due to how nuts can control fats in the blood. If you take the various fats, we don't want our cholesterol level to be too high, we know that. We don't want LDL, that's low density lipoprotein, the bad LDL, the bad cholesterol, we don't want that to be high. And the first clinical trial was done many years ago at Loma University in '93, and they looked at walnuts, and they proved that walnuts lowered cholesterol by 12% and LDL cholesterol by 18%. And since that trial, there's been over 40 rather large clinical trials performed. And if you take 25 of those together, the meta-analysis, where they looked at the effect of 67 grams of nuts per day, it lowered cholesterol by 5% and LDL-C by 7%. The tests, the trials go on and on and on, and they are all saying the same thing, that nuts lower cholesterol and they lower the bad cholesterol, the LDL. Linoleic acid. Some of you know this already, but nuts contain quite a large amount of linoleic acid. It's a polyunsaturated fatty acid, a PUFA. They contain between 10 and 40%. And various papers have looked at the effect of linoleic acid. And they have concluded that linoleic acid decreases cardiovascular disease risk markers. It reduces total cholesterol. It reduces triglycerides, which again is a fat in the blood we don't want. It reduces the bad cholesterol, LDL. It also reduces VLDL, that's very low density lipoprotein. These are particularly atherogenic, in other words, plaque forming. It also has been proven to reduce ApoB particles. Not many of you will have heard of ApoB. ApoB is apolipoprotein B100. These are really nasty particles that exist in the blood and can give rise to quite dangerous fatty plaques. And linoleic acid can reduce those. And another atherogenic particle, LP(a), silly name, I know, but it's a really nasty particle. Linoleic acid can decrease LP(a). So linoleic acid is a truly remarkable fatty acid. There are various mechanisms. Why does all this, why is it so healthy? Well, there was a nice paper published in Frontiers of Bioscience. They looked at Brazil nuts and they tried to work out what mechanisms in nuts actually gave rise to this CVD protection. Well, some of the theories, starting from the top, maybe it's because that nuts are full of phytosterols, which block cholesterol absorption. Could it be because of selenium, which is at quite a high dose, which improves arterial performance, and it is an antioxidant, so it helps protect against cell damage. Linoleic and linolenic acids, this helps blood lipids and increases HDL, which is the good cholesterol. Could it be down to arginine, which is an amino acid, which helps with arterial stiffness because it generates NO, nitric oxide? Could it be due to the high amount of polyphenols? Could it be due to fiber? Because, as I said before, typically nuts contain around 10% of fiber, which blocks cholesterol or can prevent the absorption. Could it be due to tocopherols, which is a type of vitamin E? These are antioxidants. Or could it be down to the magnesium levels, which again are good for endothelial health? It could be all of them. It could be one or two of them. But there is no doubt about it. Nuts contain a whole variety of very, very healthful and protecting ingredients. What about the type 2 diabetes? Again, there were many trials done on type 2 diabetes, looking at nut eaters. If you look at the bottom part of the graph, going from left to right, you can see that we're going from very low ingestion of peanuts right through to higher ingestion of peanuts. And the y-axis, we're looking at relative risk. So we want the graphs to come down, which is exactly what they do. And these were huge studies done over 16 years. And it was proven that on post and premenopausal women, the benefit was 27 to 33% lower risk of getting type 2 diabetes. And if you looked at BMI of less than 25 people, that increased to 45%. So people with a lower BMI, when they ate higher levels of peanuts, that gave rise to a 45% risk reduction. There is a whole stack of RCT data, that's randomized controlled trials. Some are null and some give rise to some benefit. So the RCT data is a little bit all over the place. But there's more evidence. The NHS-1 and NHS-2, that's the Nurses' Health Study, looked at walnuts, 2 servings a week only. That's not a lot. And they saw a 24% risk reduction in diabetes. And there was a Chinese study over 4 or 5 years on 64,000 people showing a 20% risk reduction. And the review in 2023 concluded that nut consumption could play a role in the prevention and the management of type 2 diabetes. Another thing which is definitely worth mentioning, I don't want to get too technical here, is endothelial function. Quickly speaking, the endothelium is a layer of cells on the inside of our arteries and veins. Endothelial health is very, very important for cardiovascular health. And if you look at a technique called FMD, flow-mediated dilatation, you can look at the way in which a blood vessel opens up when it is subject to shear. So basically what happens is you take an arm, you wrap a very tight cuff around it, you use a technique, ultrasound, to look at how wide the blood vessel is, you release the cuff, you then look at how wide the blood vessel dilates below the cuff, and basically you're looking at these 3 readings. So before dilatation, 0.27 centimeters wide. Then after dilation, it's 0.35 centimeters. That shows a pretty good endothelium. If you look at the nut experiments where they looked at nuts and they looked at endothelial health, they looked at this dilation, you can see compared to a controlled diet, which dilated, let's say, about 3 to 3.5. After a walnut diet, just 4 weeks, you got a pretty big increase in the ability of the blood vessels to dilate. That is really good. That is improved endothelial health and improved elasticity. And EFSA have even allowed walnuts to make that approved claim. Nuts also lower hypertension or blood pressure risk. We talked about endothelial function. It's actually related quite closely to blood pressure. Now, 14 million people have high blood pressure in the UK. 9 million only, though, have been diagnosed and are being treated with pharmaceuticals, which means there's a lot of people out there with high blood pressure and they don't know about it, which is quite serious because high blood pressure gives rise or increases risk of stroke pretty significantly. In a massive physician's health study trial, another cohort of around 16,000 people who were free of high blood pressure at the start, you can see on the little graphic there that the percentage reduction in the red circle, the percentage reduction of high blood pressure went from 0 to -4 to -8 to -22% in terms of the amount of nuts that people ate. So if you're eating nuts, let's say 7 times a week, you got a 22% reduction in entering into a hypertensive mode. So this is really quite dramatic. The mechanism might be due to potassium content, it might be due to magnesium, or it could be due to one of the amino acids that you find in nuts at quite a high level called arginine, which can give rise to the production of NO, nitric oxide, which helps the blood vessels dilate. A recent meta-analysis published in 2015 showed that the sub-analysis showed that pistachios actually lowered systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Systolic and diastolic just refers to the highest and the lowest. So, for example, if you have a blood reading of 120 over 80, the 120 is systolic and the 80 is diastolic, just so you know. Mixed nuts was also shown to reduce blood pressure, but only diastolic blood pressure. And the strongest effect was shown on patients who actually did not have type 2. What are the mechanisms? It's believed to be the fact that high monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids could have an effect. Talked about linoleic acid, which is one of the PUFAs before. Phytosterols might have an effect. Lutein may have an effect. That's a polyphenolic which exists in nuts. As perhaps vitamin E might have an effect. That's a very important antioxidant. And again, arginine, I've mentioned that before. Arginine is a precursor to nitric oxide. Going swiftly on to NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I think I mentioned that nearly 30% of people in the UK are walking around with fatty liver. Pretty unhealthy. If you look at the NHANES database, which is the equivalent of the NDNS, the National Diet Nutrition Survey in the UK, they looked at people's bloods. They looked at what was called the FLI, the fatty liver index, and they found that nut and seed consumption was associated with a lower NAFLD. The benefit was even seen with people eating between 15 and 30 grams of nuts per day. For some reason, females had a bigger benefit than males, and a further quite large Chinese study showed that NAFLD was actually reduced by 15% in those people who consumed nuts and seeds on a regular basis. Depression. We talked about poor mental health 15, 20 minutes ago, and 109 million days are lost at a massive cost every single year due to poor mental health. And one stat which I find shocking is that over 20 million antidepressants were prescribed in 2021. We know that diet of ultra-processed foods are linked to higher depression risk. We know that. That's been proven. So diet can play a really big role. Going back to nuts again, one serving of nuts per day showed a 17% less diagnosed depression. The UK Biobank study on 13,000 people, one serving lowered depression by 17%. The Predimed trial, very big, famous trial, over 3 years, 41% lower depression versus no nut eaters. Another Predimed trial analysis over 24 months showed that nut eating slowed cognitive decline. And the Aristotle trial, which was a randomized controlled trial over 6 months, it was shown that nut eaters had improved cognition and they had reduced stress and anxiety compared to zero nut eaters. That is the data, surprising though it may be. Going further, the Predimed trial data on 6,000 people, a recent 23 analysis on overweight, obese, and those with metabolic syndrome, which are most people, to be honest. It was a 2-year follow-up and they had a battery of cognitive tests. That's what they were concentrating on. And they showed that a higher frequency of nut consumption was associated with favorable changes in cognitive function. And they actually showed that there was a dose-response relationship between nut consumption and a delay in cognitive decline over the period of test. In other words, about 2 years. And reproductive health. There's not a lot of papers on this, but I did dig up some very interesting material. We know that age, bad nutrition, endocrine disorders like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, and sperm abnormalities, all these can unfortunately make getting pregnant very, very difficult. There's been a brand new meta-analysis published this year called the Prospero study on walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts, just 2 servings daily. And it was looked at over around 12 weeks. The intervention was about 12 weeks. They showed that on semen, the motility improved by 51%, morphology improved by 54%, and sperm vitality improved by 61%. Data also showed an increase in sperm count and also reduced DNA fragmentation of the sperm. And they believe that was due to, again, the polyphenol content of the nuts, the vitamin E content, the omega-3 ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, and also perhaps the selenium and zinc played a role. Cancer risk reduction. There are many, many, many trials out there. I've just taken a handful here. On stage 3 colon cancer patients, over 800 people, nut eating showed that there was a 57% higher recurrence-free survival. Breast cancer patients, over 3,500, 26% increased survival rate. Prostate cancer patients, just 28 grams a day, lowered prostate mortality by over 30%. And a recent systematic review and meta-analysis on nearly 50,000 multiple cancers showed that 28 grams of nuts reduced cancer mortality by 11%. And that is a pretty brand new paper. There are many more out there. Moving swiftly on to seeds. There are no simple seeds-only trials that I could find. We know that the nutrient profile of seeds is very, very similar to nuts. And the highest quality research really is a combination meta-analysis by Eric Arneson, published only last year. This was a combination of 15 huge observational trials, but he combined it with many randomized controlled trials, RCTs, with huge follow-up times from 3.5 to 32 years across 70,000 participants. So this really is a mega study. And some of you can look at the forest plot on the left later if you want to look at the detail. But if you look at the right-hand side in the blue box, seeds and nuts combined lowered risks of many cardiovascular diseases, 19% less CVD, minus 23% CVD death, minus 18 coronary heart disease, minus 25 CHD death, minus 9 stroke, and minus 13 stroke death. So again, this was a huge trial, and all of these were very significant clinical findings. The authors concluded that the consumption of both nuts and seeds have a probable causal relationship with reductions in cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. Once authors come out and say it's got a probable causal relationship, they are pretty certain that there is a very, very strong relationship. If you look at the heart associations, they are advocating nuts and seeds. The British Heart Foundation, for example, is saying include nuts and seeds as part of a heart-healthy diet. The American Heart Association, similar. Nuts and seeds could help actually reduce heart disease. If you look at the global health metrics, and this was a 2021 analysis, in 2021, a diet low in nuts and seeds was responsible for 16.3 million dailies and 658,000 deaths. A daily is a loss of a healthy year, basically. It was the 4th largest leading dietary risk factor for attributable mortality. A diet low in nuts and seeds was the 4th leading dietary risk factor, according to this work. And according to a GBD, Global Burden of Disease study, they are saying that people are only eating about 12% of what they should eat in terms of nuts and seeds. And they concluded that diets low in nuts, seeds, and also dried fruit contribute to 4 of the top 8 risk factors for mortality. And this is just an extract from the report. You can see all the various risks on the right-hand side. Diets high in sodium was the biggest risk. And along the graph on the bottom, this is the death rate per 100,000. And you can see very clearly that diets low in fruits, diets low in nuts and seeds, diet low in fiber. We have high fiber content in nuts and seeds and fruits, and a diet low in polyunsaturated fatty acids. These were 4 really major risk factors. Let's move on to dried fruits briefly, which is the last part of the talk. Let's have a quick look at the nutrient profile of dried fruits, just like we did with nuts and seeds. Little bit simpler. Top left in the blue, fiber. Fiber is the real hero of the dried fruits. But they also contain many really, really helpful, really important essential micronutrients: manganese, vitamin A, copper, iron, magnesium, potassium, and a few more. And they also contain high levels of polyphenols. Polyphenols are these really, really healthful biochemicals which exist in plants. Flavonoids you've heard of, anthocyanidins, phenolics, carotenes, lutein, zeaxanthin, great for the eye health, stilbenes, phytoestrogens, and the words go on and on and on. Again, because of these high levels, EFSA, European Food Safety Authority, have allowed dried fruits to make certain health claims because they have enough of the ingredients to show real effects. And again, this has been approved by some of the very top food scientists in Europe. So dried fruits, energy claims, bone claims, protection of cell claims, blood pressure, iron transport, immunity, and there are others. So there are many, many approved health claims, literally because of the high content of these healthful ingredients. But the real hero, as I said, is high in fiber. And prunes, which are very high in fiber, one of the EFSA claims prunes have is that it contributes to normal bowel function. Doesn't sound very exciting, but from a health viewpoint, it's a very exciting health to have. Normal bowel function is really, really important. So let's quickly look at fiber. It is the hero ingredient, and we know from 30 slides ago that we are desperately in need of more fiber. The SACN, this is the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition in the UK, they conclude that fiber can reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, type 2, and many colorectal cancers by significant amounts. But that reduction of 7, 8, 9% is for every 7 grams a day. So if you're getting 8 grams or 10 grams or 14 grams, you're going to double those benefits. And we know that low fruit intake ranks among the top 3 dietary risk factors for cardiovascular disease. This again is a forest plot. This is a meta-analysis of 22 cohort studies. And if you look at that data in a much easier to understand graph, you can see that as you eat more and more fiber, the relative risk comes down quickly and significantly. So the SACN said there was very strong evidence that higher fiber will lower cardiovascular disease and also events such as heart attacks. And this is also going to be beneficial to the microbiome. It's going to be beneficial because it produces SFAs, that's not saturated fatty acids, that is short chain fatty acids, which are very, very healthy. Stool transit time and frequency, and it will also increase stool weight. All of these have really healthy, beneficial effects of fiber. So each 7 grams of fiber gives 9% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. That's pretty dramatic. Fiber is also very good for general gut health as well. We know that 500,000 people are affected every single year by poor and ongoing gut health problems. Inflammatory bowel disease, there are 2 major types, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. These are really quite nasty. And we know that IBD increased by about 1/3 over the last decade. I don't know why, but that's not good news. If you look at the data from the UK Biobank cohort study on nearly 500,000 patients with a 12-year follow-up, high fiber is associated with a 26% lower risk of IBD and a 52% lower risk of CD. They are dramatic increases. They are really nice benefits to have. An SACN review, they looked at more benefits of fiber. The top blue box, we've already looked at the reduced risk of IBD and Crohn's. They also found an association between higher fiber and less type 2 diabetes. Relative risk in the yellow RR of 0.94, that means a 6% reduction in type 2. And if you look at the higher consumption of fiber and reduced incidence of colon cancer, relative risk 0.92, that's minus 8%. So very powerful data from a variety of cohort studies reviewed by SACN. Every 7 grams of fiber per day, there's an 8% reduction in colorectal cancer risk. Dried fruits and health benefits. So these are just some of the papers that I looked at. We looked at some raisin studies, 4 servings a week in the Nurses' Health Study, nearly 200,000 people, 8% less hypertension. Dried fruits, UK women's cohort study, 80 grams a day. That's not a huge amount, 8% less cardiovascular mortality. Raisins, 3 servings a week, Nurses' Health Study, 12% lower risk of type 2. Raisins versus isocaloric snacks. These are snacks with the same amount of calories over 12 weeks. Systolic and diastolic blood pressure lowered by 7 and 10 millimeters. I would certainly like to have that. And prunes, on a whole variety of randomized controlled trials, it was proven to lower LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, significantly. So finally,
Max,
we're going to wrap
sorry,
up.
Max, just to interject here, I just wanted to flag that we've got to 3 o'clock, but obviously this is such a fascinating insight into the benefits of dried fruit, nuts and seeds. We're going to obviously crack on and carry on with this. And we are recording this as well. So if you absolutely can't stay on, please be aware and know that we're recording this session and we'll send it out. And at the end of this, we'll still put a few questions to Max as well, because we've seen some amazing questions coming through in the Q&A. But I just wanted to flag that we're fully aware that we've slightly run over, but the session's being recorded and we will send that out at a later date. Back over to you, Max.
Okay, thanks for the warning. I think there's just about 5 or 6 quick slides at the end. And these are what I called elephants in the room. And these are the controversial areas, of which there are 2 main types. So nut consumption makes you fat. No, it does not. Nut consumption does not lead to weight gain. This is a culmination of a whole stack of studies which I looked at. 5 studies. I haven't got the reference here. Yes, I have, from neutral or inverse association with nut eating. 3 cohort studies, neutral or inverse association. In other words, people are lighter, not heavier. The Spanish Sun cohort study, nearly 9,000 people, inverse association. Nurses' Health Study, 51,000, half a kilogram less weight with nut eaters. And the Predimed study also agrees, inverse association. So nut consumption really does not lead to weight gain. This is a real fallacy. The NHANES data, very, very similar. I won't read all this out. You can see it in the slides. But look at the left-hand side. The NHANES, like the National Diet Nutrition Survey over many, many years, showed that the dried fruit eaters had lower body weight, lower BMI, and also a smaller waist circumference. Another one, will dried fruit cause dental caries? Now, this is a controversial area. We know from the NHS, Public Health England, British Dental Association, British Dietetic Association, basically everyone is agreeing because they're seen as a bit sticky and maybe they will lower the pH and produce acid, they may produce caries. And everyone is saying they're very helpful, please eat them, but please don't eat them between meal times. You can eat them at meal times, not between. It's not quite as simple as that. I'm saying here, I'm sticking my neck out a bit, having looked at the data. Dried fruit is actually a lot safer for teeth than you think. This is an experiment that was done, a huge experiment, looking at the pH of the plaque on people's teeth. They rinsed with sucrose, one group, another group rinsed, 8 bran flakes, another group 8 raisins. You can see, if you look at the right-hand side, the sugary drink caused the pH in the mouth to drop to 5.59. Bran flakes, the pH dropped to 5.88, and raisins, it only dropped to 6.02. Now, we know that pH 5.5 is the danger level where it is becoming a little bit dangerously acidic or cariogenic. And you can see that raisins was actually better than bran flakes, which really surprised me. The conclusion, raisins are actually less cariogenic than bran flakes. That is absolutely clear. Another test on plaque and raisins, they looked at ATP bioluminescence. They swabbed the teeth of 156 athletes in 2011. They asked them to eat 1 ounce of raisins, and 15 minutes later, they swabbed the teeth again. And they measured the plaque level, and there was 43% less plaque on the people who had eaten the raisins. They repeated the experiment with no raisins and just a quick glass of water. And after 15 minutes, there was no change in the plaque level. So the people who ate the raisins ended up with less plaque. I leave it there. So both control and raisins, yes, perhaps there's a small caries risk, but raisins do carry a much lower risk. And Wu Professor Wu concludes that raisins do not increase the risk of caries. Clearance rate, stickiness. There was a huge study done. 48 snack foods were looked at for stickiness and clearance, and dates ranked 15th out of 48, raisins ranked 29th out of 48. So they weren't as sticky as people thought. And there was a lovely report from Sadler and Lovegrove, big systematic review, and they concluded there is limited data to suggest that dried fruits are any worse than other snacks. But more data is always needed. So though raisins are sweet, research says that they do not adhere to the teeth long enough to promote caries, and raisins may even help clear other cariogenic sugars from the tooth surface, according to Booth. So thought, based on all of this, perhaps are nuts, seeds and dried fruits the unsung heroes of nutrition? So in summary, the situation. Poor diets cause 17% of all UK deaths. Fibre intake is very, very low indeed. And we know that 70% of the population fail to reach the RDA on 7 really essential micronutrients. The science is also clear. Nuts, seeds and dried fruits contain very helpful levels of fibre, vitamins, minerals, linoleic fatty acid, omega-3, and also a good level of protein. And there are health benefits from ingesting these: cardiovascular health, blood pressure, LDL cholesterol lowering, NAFLD lowering, and it goes on and on. So could increasing consumption of nuts, seeds and dried fruits help more with the burden of disease? Help more than we actually realize? A recent study called the Zoe Predict study, done on around 1,000 people, they said that 95% of people actually snack every day, and 76% of us snack twice daily. Nearly a quarter of total calories come from that snacking, which really surprised me. And 74% of that snacking calories during the snacks are actually very unhealthy. And that was clearly backed up by looking at blood, where they looked at biomarkers. And I would say the following: imagine the health benefits if we could tempt people to carry on with their snacks, but snack on nuts, seeds or dried fruits. So how do we turn this into a tangible behavior? And this is the final slide. A recommendation perhaps would be to revamp the 5 a day. The 5 a day has been very unsuccessful, according to the Instigator many years ago. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually revamp the 5 a day and talk about the 5 a day being fruit, veg, nuts, seeds, and dried fruit? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Max. That was absolutely fascinating, as I'm sure you all agree. We have run over ever so slightly, and we've had a wave of fascinating questions as well in the Q&A. Too many to run through today, so we will respond to all of those through next week. But I've picked out a couple, Max, which I thought were pertinent and very interesting, and not necessarily questions that we've seen before, or questions that didn't come up at our event at the Gherkin. So the first one, if you start eating nuts regularly at an older age, will it still have a positive impact on slowing cognitive decline?
The answer has to be yes. Absolutely. I mean, obviously, the earlier you can start with any healthy intervention is going to be a good thing. It's like, saving money in the bank, so to speak. But no, at any age, you can turn your health around. More exercise, healthier diet, better sleep. If you can do those 3 things, you can certainly make a difference in terms of your health going forward. Absolutely.
Brilliant. I think it came up a couple of times, as mentioned in your presentation, but the questions have come in. We had a few of them around here. What does it mean to have a healthy gut microbiome, and how do nuts and dried fruit help with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the microbiome is a fascinating area these days. We still don't know enough about it. We're only starting to learn about it. But the microbiome is, 70% of our immune system is in the microbiome, in the colon. We have a whole range of bugs, bacteria, viruses, fungi, a whole range of things. And about 80% are, let's call it, healthy bacteria, and about 20% are pathogenic, bad bacteria. And as you get a little bit older, Or if you are sick, you can suffer from what's called dysbiosis. This is where the microbiome goes a little bit out of kilter. Some people talk about a garden. You've got the flowers, the good guys, and the weeds, who are the bad guys. And if you let the weeds start to infiltrate the flowers, you can end up with a really bad garden. And the microbiome is exactly the same thing. And nuts and seeds, I hinted at it briefly during my presentation. They have a whole range of very helpful materials which can help the bacteria feed. I mean, nuts and seeds are types of prebiotic. In other words, they can be a very healthy food for bugs because they contain a lot of healthy fiber and they contain PUFAs and MUFAs. And all of this can help the gut microbes actually give rise to things called short chain fatty acids, things like butyric acid. They have been proven without doubt to be very, very healthy. And that's really how nuts and seeds can help the microbiome. I'm a great believer in the microbiome. I really am.
Excellent. Interesting one here, which I think probably resonates with information we've been told as a nation over the last 20 to 30 years. But this one I pulled out, so I found it personally quite interesting. How is cholesterol good for me when over many years I've been told it's bad for me?
Oh, I could do a whole lecture on that. That's fascinating.
That's the next one.
Yeah, that's a really nice one. I mean, I don't want to pontificate too long, but yeah, every single cell in our body needs cholesterol. It's part of the not the cell wall, but the little cytoplasmic layer just under the cell wall. And you need cholesterol in your cells. Otherwise, that cell will not be alive. You need cholesterol. You're right. We have been told over many years, cholesterol is bad. We need to reduce our cholesterol, blah, blah, blah. The reason for that is that a lot of people do have levels of cholesterol in their blood, perhaps which is a bit too high. And if you've got high cholesterol, you've probably got high LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, that's what it's called, LDL. That's sometimes called the bad cholesterol. And if you've got high cholesterol, you've probably got high LDL cholesterol. We know now that LDL cholesterol is linked to potential heart disease. But interestingly, in one of those slides, if you go to your doctors and you get your LDL results, your cholesterol results, a lot of doctors don't even know this. The thing which really causes ASCVD, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and arterial plaques isn't necessarily the LDL itself. It's the LDL particle, because we have particles of these things. And the smaller the particles, the more atherogenic, the more dangerous they are. And once they implant themselves under the endothelium in the arteries, veins, or whatever, once they do that, they are prone to oxidation. And this is why I'm a great fan of antioxidants, because if they become oxidized, that's when they become nasty, and then a whole cascade takes place, and you get this horrible atherosclerotic plaque, which can cause serious heart disease, of course, or vascular disease. So, I mean, in a nutshell, cholesterol itself as a molecule is a requirement for life, but we don't want too much of it. And we certainly don't want too much saturated fat in our diets, because saturated fat is a precursor to the bad LDL cholesterol, which is a precursor potentially to arterial plaques.
Brilliant. Thanks, Max. Final question. I think really this is probably covered in your final recommendation, really. But in your view, how often should we be consuming these products? And by these products, we mean dried fruit, nuts, and seeds. And how much of these should we have as a portion?
Yeah, what's a portion? A portion differs. I mean, I have nuts every single day, and I don't know what the portion is. I don't weigh it out. I'm not that much of a nerd, but I do have a reasonable amount of nuts every single day. How much do you need? Well, I mean, if you go back to the white paper, or if you go back to the slides, you'll see that many of the scientific studies were done on 28 grams, for example, per day. Some were done on a bit less, some were done on a bit more, but 28 grams is a large handful, if you like, of nuts or seeds. And I would go for a regular serving of nuts. I wouldn't have 200 grams of nuts on a weekend. I would go for a regular daily amount of nuts. It's just so easy compared to fruit and veg, especially if you're not a veg lover. And I'm not a lover of veg. I know I need to eat more. And my wife's very good to me, and I get force-fed veg because I know I know it's very healthy, and I do like fruit. But it's so easy for me to actually have a handful of nuts on a daily basis. It's so easy. And I do that twice a day, maybe. And I think those people, and that's 71% of the population who are not getting their 5 a day, on those people, if they knew that a handful of nuts would have as much, if not more benefit than vegetables, that's bound to help the health of the nation. I have no doubt at all about it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Max. Well, that brings our webinar to a close for today. I'd like to once again thank Dr. Max for his contribution and his work and his fascinating insight. But most importantly, I really want to thank the audience for your participation and your contributions in the Q&A. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be shared over email. And if you want to, you can head to our website, whitworth.co.uk, to download your own copy of Dr. Max's white paper for free. Just like to say, keep an eye out for any future events and do get in touch via the Mission Nutrition email if you've got any other further questions. But that's it. Thanks again. I hope you've enjoyed this session and have a fantastic weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.